Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1106th New Social Environment. I'm Madison, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Nicola Vassell and Ginevra de Blasio. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Nicola Vassell is the founder of Nicola Vassell Gallery, a contemporary art gallery committed to discourse that widens the lens of the history and future of art. The gallery works with many artists, including Alvaro Barrington and Ming Smith, who have both been interviewed on our NSE. Formerly CEO of art consultancy Concept NV, Vassell specialized in collection building and developing exhibitions rooted in cultural phenomenology. She was a director at Deitch Projects and Pace Gallery, New York, and a visiting lecturer at Sotheby's Institute of Art. Vassell is a member of New Museum's Artemis Council. Ginevra de Blasio is a writer and curator from Rome, Italy, now based in New York City. She graduated with a BA in art history and visual culture from the University of Exeter and with an MA in visual arts administration from NYU. We are lucky to have Ginevra as a contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. And now I'm going to go ahead and pass our virtual mic over to Ginevra. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Madison, and thank you, Nicola, for being here today and having this conversation with me. And I would like to start with something a bit less exciting, but as it was highlighted, you had a lot of different experiences in the art world, from galleries to curatorial agencies and so on. So I would like to start with just like if you can give us an intro to how you, let's say, went through one to the other one and how that led you to then creating your own gallery.
Well, it was a progression of sorts. To begin overarchingly, I understood very clearly, very early on, that the art world just seemed like the place for me to be, as an arena where ideas, creativity, and, you know, thought all coincided. I felt strongly that it was just my world. And so I wanted to experiment, to have a sense of what it might be like to work with a gallery, to have a consultancy. And it all sort of came together, everything at once, challenging, beautiful, and rewarding. So, once I entered the field, I understood that there was never really anywhere else I could be. So, the business of it, the hard work of it all appealed to me. And so more broadly, I would say that the constituents of the art world really drew me to it, and I wanted to play in each part.
Absolutely. And through your creative agency, you were able to touch upon various segments of the creative industry, right? So it wasn't solely like selling, but it was also curating and collaborating with creatives that are not only in the, let's say, gallery field. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, so the creative endeavor around the agency and consultancy really came in the aftermath of my gallery experience. And those early years in the galleries were very exciting and supercharged, by youth and this kind of very generative abandon. I would say that we were the first sort of post 9/11 generation. We came of age at that time, and there was definitely a sense, a palpable sense, that the world was going to change irrevocably. So the first few years, I worked with Jeffrey Deitch at the Downtown Gallery Deitch project. I also lived there, and what happened was that a very vibrant and committed community formed around us. There was no social media. We had to find ways to get together and do things. So, so this great scene emerged, and I remember the distinct feeling at that time that we were really a universe unto ourselves, and that the rest of the traditional art world is sort of lived in another realm, but that they were quite fascinated with us. So, you know, that was a very, very exciting time. And so once Deitch Projects ended its chapter, I went to work with Pace Gallery. And Pace Gallery was the polar opposite. Blue chip, much larger structure, and I really wanted to learn what that meant. And so it was definitely an education, and I got everything that I needed there. So at the end of that gallery run, which was a little more than a decade, I knew that I didn't want to go work with another gallery. And so the consultancy kind of popped up quite naively, to be honest with you. We did our first show. It was a pop-up called Black Eye. And it was a very important exhibition in hindsight. We did it on Walker Street, like 10 years ago. And we exhibited some of the most important artists of our day. We had Kerry James Marshall, Steve McQueen, we had David Hammond, Rasheed Johnson, Simone Lee, Nick Cave, Wangechi, Mutu, Neri Ward, Dina Lawson, Sanford Biggers, Jacoby Sattaway, Derek Adams, Kahinde, So we really worked very hard. It was incredibly challenging, but social media was also gaining traction. I would say Instagram particularly. So we really used that as a tool, and it was a game changer for us. So quickly thereafter, we began advising and building collections. And so what happened out of that was that we tried to extend our capabilities in terms of using our pop-up model to develop more kind of intrepid projects for clients who were very interested in that, namely like the Dean collection, helmed by Swiss Beats and Alicia Keys. We developed the No Commission series, which was a curated invitational. So we would invite artists to participate. And the whole premise of that project was that we would, present the artist, sell the work, give the artist 100% of the proceeds, and we were backed by a corporate sponsor. So therein was a whole kind of confluence of different cultural aspects that created really an opportunity for artists. And it took us all around the world. We went to London with it, Shanghai, Berlin, New York, Miami. And it was a very exciting time. So, it was this wonderful weaving of, a kind of fealty to the artists, to the galleries by way of developing collections, and then really hitting the cultural mainframe through these kind of more roving project. So it was a very, very exciting time, and the world was ripe and open for it.
Beautiful. Sounds so exciting. And what I find most interesting is after having had this experience, you ultimately returned to the gallery model. Let's call it the traditional gallery model. Although I know that it's not as traditional, your gallery. But my question here is, how come did you decide to open a new gallery in such a competitive space like Chelsea? I wonder if you can speak a little bit about that, and also in what way do you think that your gallery diversifies from all of the, let's say, galleries that have been there for a very long time too?
Yeah. Well, it was really a matter of course. At a certain point, I felt I'd hit a ceiling with the agency and consultancy. It was kind of the end of an era, and for me, and I was itching to try something new. And by my side was, my faithful right hand for the Ages, Tanya Morgan, who's COO, Chief Operating Officer of the gallery. And so, we always travel this road together. And I felt like perhaps going back to the gallery world would be a good thing. And I decided this summer before COVID that I would try for my own gallery. And of course, subsequently, COVID hit, and it both accelerated and hampered down the possibility. So on the one hand, that kind of zero distraction setting allowed me to work day and night uninterrupted on the idea. So that was incredibly consequential. And on the other hand, the landscape had come to a sudden and terrifying halt, right? There was no sense of what a physical location might even mean. Nevertheless, again, heaped with some measure of naivete, we took the leap, understanding that often great opportunity comes from adversity, and we're prepared to accept whatever conditions were going to manifest on the ground. I think on a more existential level, the pandemic wrought a whole new way of considering the social construct and the social contract. So it got us thinking, and it definitely shifted things, particularly around gender, identity, sexuality, freedom. And, innately, I understood that I didn't need to stray far from home to add to the discourse that was swirling. As a Black woman from the Caribbean, I felt I could be both subjective and objective in my offerings, as, public called for a deeper dive on new perspectives. So, effectively, my experiences and observations melded or really ground, it set the standard for the vision of the gallery. And my curiosities basically sent it farther afield. Now, in terms of opening in Chelsea specifically, I would say that, Chelsea is the gold standard. And I'll never forget, as I was considering different locations, when Fred Eversley, he put it very simply to me. He said, listen, just think about where your artists would aspire to being. And, that was it. And a great space was available that Listen Gallery had occupied, and a great friend and wonderful architect, Christian Bassmann, had beautifully redesigned, excuse me. So, it was kind of a no-brainer. It's an artist-owned building. We have great landlords, and it all really fell into place. So Chelsea kind of just happened in a wonderful way. And as luck would have it, 2 days before we opened, New York lifted the mandates. So it was like, all that we had sort of feared, but were prepared to confront anyway, shifted because the world was back out. So that was incredible. Now, in terms of, what sets our gallery apart, I suppose I would sort of leave that to an audience to decide, in the sense that, we definitely pluck our ideas from the mainframe of the cultural landscape. And we, citing, of course, that earlier plunge into cultural phenomenology, this idea that, the ripples that happen culturally, societally can create, it's like the butterfly flapping wings in the east that create a hurricane in the west. These things just have a way and a pattern, and identifying them is very an interesting job for us. So we like to sort of bring that thinking that we've long immersed ourselves in to the table. And, we try to ensure that those ideas hit in a specific way at a specific time. And, we select our artists very carefully, and we work incredibly hard to deliver high quality presentations and exhibitions. So, our public responds very supportively. And so I would say those are a few things.
Thank you. Thank you for this. It was made complete sense. And actually, as you were speaking about, the pandemic and everything, I just thought that it's a perfect moment to also introduce the show that you have up. Because, like, in a way, when I came to see the show the other day, then I left and it was like, this is such a perfect, let's say, reflection of also the pandemic. It's a beautifully filled room with all of these depictions of the artist representing herself in moments of sleep, which we were all doing a lot,
Yes.
um, I guess. And so I think it's interesting to maybe apply the question I asked before about, let's say, what characterizes your artist and what you choose in them and what you look for in an artist, maybe more specifically to this artist, because it's a very hard question to answer. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, Wangari is an amazing, amazing artist, one of the great painters of her generation. And we worked on this project for 4 years. We started talking before I opened the gallery. And so, we're so thrilled that it's culminated in this moment in which she decided to take quite a courageous leap in her practice, known for these incredibly, patterned and developed paintings of that really focus on diasporic liminality, this idea of being from a place, coming to another place, and trying to find a sense of belonging, particularly through cultural material and material culture. But with this, she decided, this bedimmed boundary show, she decided to invert, in a way, her principle. And she wanted to look at the idea of self-reflection. And I think much like rest has kind of followed us from the pandemic, I think the idea of rest, care, self-care, all these things are now much more paramount than they had been as we really assess quality of life, what the meaning of life, and how we function therein. So she, and of course, she developed this whole idea of what interiority might look like, but situated on the fulcrum of dreams, which in fact is where so many creative ideas are born. And so she, you know, she discovered in her research that she experiences two unique and rare forms of sleep state known as hypnagogia and hypnopompia, which are effectively bookends to the deep sleep experience, traveling into and out of deep sleep, where lucid dreaming and hyper brain activity takes place. So, you're very much palpably feeling your dreams, and the brain is really at work. And so she wanted to, present that and set up video cameras in all her sleep areas. So every single painting in the exhibition is reflective of a sleep experience that she had. Now, what heightens this entire presentation is the fact that it's a show about self-portraiture, right? And I often feel, and really always feel, that the artist's self-portrait is the most privileged access that an artist is giving you to their practice. It really situating where they are in their head, where they are in their sort of conceptual uh, grid work, and it's and they're giving us a window into their vulnerabilities. So the fact that this entire show is self-portraiture is also incredibly powerful. Now, what's also interesting is that she stripped away a lot of the sort of wonderful patterning and palette play that she typically uses to bring it to an incredibly minimal space. And so what that allows for is a certain kind of psychological, you know, energy to permeate. There's a sense that there is a collapse of actual space, dream space, and time happening in these works. They feel durational. You feel her anxiety, her restlessness, this idea that in fact it's about her, but there is a very universal sense that we're all going through this. We're all struggling with sleep hygiene or how to quiet the mind because the world is anxious. So, it ticks so many boxes. And at the same time, she's leaping courageously into new facets of her own capabilities and, is still giving you the most incredible gestural play I see in in the world. I mean, she's just one of the great painters, and so all these, wonderful conflations really offer up a picture of her journey till now, which in of itself is fascinating.
And I found the show to be incredibly intimate, yet extremely relatable, obviously. And what I found most interesting that I also reflected after is that usually, historically, these almost monumental sizes, especially of the big panel that is on the wall, is reserved for, let's say, kind of like war scenes. And
Mm,
this moment, it's so
mm,
intimate and personal. And so it really,
mm.
I think it's so human, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
this also leads me to another thing that I think was very striking for me, apart from like obviously like the conceptual terrain of the show, it was the brushstroke. Like
Mm,
the images, like you can kind of see it, especially if we can pull up the images, the image of the title called Drop the Dungarees. It's
mm,
the yellow one. You can really see
mm.
the really like broad brush strokes and like exactly this one.
Lovely.
I find
Oh,
this so fascinating, the way in which she is able to like depict the folds, and it almost, as we were
yes.
saying in the gallery, it almost looks I don't know, like the Virgin's kind of
Oh,
vest for how
absolutely.
imposing it is. But then it's a simple, like cover sheet.
Yes, yes. I mean, you hit all the nails there. I think, she's definitely conversing with history painting, this idea of monument, the monumental, while rooting in a narrative of what is kind of headline news, afflicting the the world writ large. And in terms of her painterly mechanics, what I recognize is that she's taking her facility for all that incredible patterning and not, sitting in the wake of the greats like Matisse in that way, but taking that and applying it to the flesh, right? This idea that the flesh is now composed in a way that is more akin to this high patterning is fascinating. She's also calling to Freud and Saville and, the greats before her. So she's not unaware of the history and she's applying it, but in this very personal, very contemporary way. You're talking about the folds, fabrics was the great and continues to be in some cases the great domain of the great painters. How you work a fabric with paint is, yes, so that is one of the great medals you chase in the canon. So, she's got it, she's there with it. And then this idea of those kind of undefined clocks showing the passage of time, which, really tells you that restlessness as, the timeline is moving, but at the same time harkens to perhaps her early years, just to touch on her biography as in finance, that could very much look like the clocks of the trading wall, where, on the trading floor, the wall of the trading floor, where, you've got the time in New York, London, Paris, so on and so on. But then this idea that time, in fact, is just fleeting, and then her eyes open to us while in a kind of hypnagogic thrust coming into out of this sleep. And there's so many things that are happening so beautifully and yet so stripped back in this painting. It's remarkable.
Absolutely. And another question that now I have that is applied to this, but kind of like is a direction towards a more general question around your artists, is that you, as you were saying before, a lot of your artists are using technologies and like how they are involved with them and speak of them. And these paintings, they are very traditional and they speak about a very natural kind of like process and also the way they're painting. Yet they have been made because of the use of cameras. As you were saying, she recorded herself sleeping. So this is an example of an artist that is able to reach this conceptual terrain through technology. I
Yeah.
was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see the artists in your gallery, let's say involving technologies or maybe criticizing them or working with them or against them. Like, what is the pattern that like you kind of see happening in this moment?
Well, I mean, I think each artist has their own tack, right, in terms of how they utilize this idea of technology from what happens in the context of their practices, this idea that indeed there is a history of art making that should not ever be abandoned. Improvements are not a bad thing, as I was reading something about Stanley Kubrick, and he said, this impulse to always create the absolutely new is it might not be as effective as adapting that which has already yielded very resonating fruit, right? So this idea that there is history, that there are materials, methods that can be improved, adapted, while of course we must acknowledge that there is a future that really is rooted in technology. And I think our artists are very much aware of that condition and grapple with it and play with it in clever ways so that both are evident without sort of compromising either. So, and then perhaps on a more kind of pedestrian level or, yeah, more widely understood perspective for social media. It's a great sort of a marketing tool and so there is utility there. So, this way of speaking to the world, of, extending that global reach that the art world really started about 15 years ago. All of that is important. So, yes, and all our artists pay attention.
Absolutely. And speaking of social media, I was wondering, obviously, social media is a incredible tool, but I also think that is very limiting for artists that are not as figurative, because obviously, like the translation of figurative art are much higher than other forms of art. And so I was wondering, what is your kind of perspective on that? Have you noticed, at least like with your artists that you're working with, that they have kind of a bigger social media involvement if they have this tendency to be more figurative? And how do you see their involvement and impact of social media on their work and maybe career? Do you have any specific example of a artist you've been working with, maybe?
Well, again, I would say that, social media has really woven itself indelibly into the fabric of society. It feels like we cannot get out of it. And artists are aware that it is a very important functionary in terms of communicating their work to the world. Are there drawbacks? Absolutely, most definitely. However, this ability to form community is very well realized there. This opportunity to communicate ideas are well situated there. I think there are some artists who are much more active. They are, it really is embedded in their storytelling, and it yields fruit. It makes sense. Now, I think all of our artists more or less utilize, and then there's some who don't even sort of play the game. Um, and in many ways, I am I'm of two minds about it all. In the one sense, understanding its utility, and on the other hand, thinking a lot more about the implications for the broader society, right? This idea that um, suddenly, you really do get cast down these algorithmic rabbit holes that promote a kind of homogeny much more than, what perhaps more natural curiosity, where that might take you, right? Down different other paths. And so I think, what happens in that setting is that this hierarchy of ideas and this sense of discernment, this ability to discern the difference between one thing and another and qualify it, is being lost. And so to identify that something is good rather than bad is becoming like a plateau situation, a gray area. There is no distinction. And I think in many ways that is the most kind of important aspect of what's happening in terms of social media and art, because our world, our business is specifically about distinction between beauty and what's challenging, what's beautiful, what is frightening, what is and so the ability for the mind to consider in a very specific way all these ideas that are coming at you is very much challenged and under threat. So, and I think our artists don't necessarily turn to technology to come to that some kind of solution there. They really go to the heart of their ideas, and then they explain them using technology.
Yeah, and this like perfectly, I think, ties to my next kind of question that aligns more with like obviously we're living, we were saying that we're living in a very difficult like political and social period. And artists at the end of the day are reflecting the environment that surrounds them and the country where they're from and what is happening today.
Yeah.
So, you know, technology is definitely a tool to expand and outreach all of that. But
Mhm.
also, I wonder if there is, again, this might be a bit of a general question, but I wonder if you are seeing that your artists, or in general, artists today, are more, let's say, vocal about their surroundings, both directly and indirectly. Like, do you feel like they are speaking about all of these issues very strongly or not quite as much? And if so, is there a specific way that you're seeing that at least like they're doing so more effectively? I know that this can be quite a bit general, but it also gives you like freedom to, take the alley.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we're going right back to that idea of ideas. What is at the center of the idea? There's so many things that you can present and highlight if you understand how to negotiate an idea, right? That an idea ought often to be layered with many different things to consider, right? And this idea that you can take a personal stance while claiming universality or ringing true to a wide swath of people is in fact the kind of it's the golden measure. It's this ability to twist and turn the way in which you think so that you might yield an outcome that can address multiple things at the same time. And that includes the political dynamic, the social dynamic, the personal dynamic, and cleverly, so that it doesn't actually cede or give up once that moment is over. It'll speak across time. So we really look at artists who have that capacity, who are not necessarily just looking to pinpoint um one topic within one part of the social dynamic, but that this is human condition as much as it is personal condition. And therefore, I'm speaking about now, but I'm speaking to the ages. And, our artists are incredible at that, incredible at that. And that really is because I think all of our artists are in possession of a similar kind of principle around energy, what I call the energy principle. Okay. This is the thread that sort of runs through them, the idea that they can, or rather they understand that the base unit of their material is energy, and the capacity to alchemize it, to transmute it, to take one thing and make it into another so that you can experience the magic, and so that several truths are being told. So yeah, that's their power. That, it's scientific as well as spiritual. And yeah, it's also remarkable.
I love this idea of the energy. As you know, we spoke about it, and I think it definitely like prepare it's something that it's really hard to describe in words, but I
Yes.
think that certain people are able to have that sensibility, and most people in the art world, I guess, and sense it and really almost feel it from certain works of art. And what I think came to my mind as you were speaking and describing, the kind of like social and political power of your artist is that, as also in this example, it's almost as if this commentary, it's very delicate. It becomes almost conceptual. So it's not as direct as I would, identify like maybe other galleries in which they have kind of like stronger out there messages.
Mhm.
And it's a more subtle kind of approach,
Yes.
which I think goes really like aligns really with this idea of like the energy. It's like you can't, it's harder to like touch and fully understand in words, but it's something that it's almost like left unspoken, and it doesn't really need to be articulated as much to be fully understood, but almost like felt more. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
Exactly. There you hit the nail on the, with the hammer. This idea that you don't have to say much more because you feel much more. And fundamentally, the job of what we do is to transform your experience. And that begins with the feeling, which then begs the question, why do I feel like this? Which travels to the thought. And then the thought will offer up myriad ways of coming to the answers. It's, as you put it, much more subtle, because there is also the principle of mystery in there, which is something that people have too willingly given up. You sort of like cast aside this idea that there is something to discover yet in the entire experience, which really is about traveling with time. I mean, if you give everything up now, what's left?
absolutely. And it also makes it much more, I think, personal and subjective for the audience to find even their own reading in art. And we have been so long educated to, interpret a work of art from A to Z and, almost iconographically. And so I think what is interesting nowadays is that sometimes a person is able to see maybe X and another Y, and they're both fine and right. And I wonder if that is something that in your gallery too, is it something that you like when, for example, someone comes, because like everyone has their own position of these things, right? So it's like, oh, this is this, or are you open to like interpretations? How do you feel your artists, align with this kind of open mentality towards like their art?
Yes, it's a pact in a way that we've all forged, right? This idea that we are fellow adventurers, curious seekers, and therefore, this idea of mystery is inherent. It's innate to the, or rather, this unfurling, this unfolding, this that you puzzle it all together. And in some ways, isn't that life, right? That you don't really get the questions front up, the answers front up. And in many cases, you don't get the answers even at the end. What you understand is that it's the journey that counts. And so, it's a pact about the adventure, the journey, the lessons that can be, plucked along the way. And, being able to measure quite palpably that you feel something strong while walking that path.
Absolutely. And this kind of also ties with the next question that I have, because, I at least am very aware of, of the problems of accessibility, of oversaturation in art, and also this idea, this pattern that is kind of like happening now of decentralization of the art world. And I too have been worked in Chelsea in a gallery, and I felt like there was quite a, a barrier to entry. I was wondering what your thoughts are around that, and how do you, if you do something to like kind of like lower these barriers, and yeah, what do you think could
Yeah.
be done in the future towards this direction?
Yes, I mean, each of those qualities you posited there are unique onto itself. So, this idea of the oversaturation is the culmination of, the last decade and a half in the art world of immense growth, of, you know, pushing the bounds of the business to its industry place, and to, all different regions in the world, and you, inviting the support structures, including, all the new clients, you just the much more global view, um, kind of colliding with the destabilizations of the economy, the macro threats of the global political situation, and in many ways, the general cycles of business, which really speak to the cycles of life, right? This idea that there is always ebb and flow. If you don't have the ebb and flow built into your model, all of them, work, life, then you're always going to be disappointed, right? So it's almost like the worst of each of those things have hit at the same time. And so some people maybe feel satiated after having really committed to that that boom cycle. They're just asking for a different set of boundaries on the situation, maybe less, higher quality, more focus. And I don't think these are bad things to ask. Sometimes less is indeed more. But in terms of accessibility and the democratization aspect, I mean, this is squarely sort of understood, I think, in the kind of nonprofit institutional world, this idea that the conversation is moved from the internal to the external, the idea that what the public is yearning for has become much more central to the development of ideas. And that in speaking to public, perhaps there will be a greater, you know, magnetic force. Um, and different swaths of population and so on will come to feel more connected to the messages that are being told. So I think this idea of meeting your viewing public somewhere where they are, or where they're next going to be, is not necessarily a bad idea. And then the idea of the democratization and the access, the decentralization. You know, we spoke a little bit about this, about the long-term plans, starting at the very beginning. It is hard for people to think about art when they're not exposed to it. This idea of education, the fact that the arts and education is basically non-existent in not only some of the major cities of the world, but curricula more broadly across the nation. I mean, it's really sad, because it's domino effect. You don't have that basic sort of exposure to the arts. You don't travel along those roads of curiosity and adventure in the same way. You don't then have the capacity to build that sense of discernment by judging quality, visual of one thing versus another. You don't get to explore all the infinities available in the creative realm. I mean, it is just such a, it is such a, it's really not great for society, what's happening. So yeah, I think these ideas of, really stretching for quality, the broader sense of the insular art world and this idea of saturation, kind of consolidating, this idea of really thinking about what the viewing public is asking for or where they're going to be next, and this idea of like, forging better citizens by educating. I mean, listen, these remedies are bigger than us, okay? But I think it's worth thinking about.
Absolutely. I think that there is a tendency to always point the finger to like galleries and institutions for having this like barrier. But the truth is,
Mhm.
like, going back to the foundation, which is education and so on, is really much of like a stronger solution. And obviously institutions and galleries can make the effort to make it, more open, but then the real job has to go from the foundations of everything. So that's a very interesting point that you raised. But going back to what we were speaking on saturation, you were speaking about this boom cycle. And we have been seeing this like boom happening for already a lot of years. And I was wondering if what is your opinion on kind of like the future of this moment in the art world? Do you feel
Mm.
like it is like a bubble that will pop, or is it just going to get bigger? And
Mm.
what is also maybe more than the art world, because that could be a hard question to answer. Maybe this question implied more to like the gallery model.
Mm.
Do you
Yes.
think it's a sustainable and a system, a model that has a longevity,
Mhm.
or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the art world more broadly will endure. It must endure because it is the record keeper of what we experience, okay? Certainly the visual and to some extent the experiential record keeper. But the galleries, I think it's also coming to the stage of acceptance, the idea that the cycle always has to be built in, right? This idea that things expand and they retreat, and therefore there will always be, the expansion and the consolidation. So that just always has to be somehow built in. And, this idea that it now begs for new kind of paradigms, theoretical paradigms, how one integrates new perspectives, including relative to the actual gallery model. Now, I don't think the gallery model can be broken because there are always the disruptors and interventionists threatening to kind of end it. But how else does an artist sort of get to the public before it reaches the sort of hallowed ground of the institution where the public can engage, make decisions, where the artist can make a living? There's a whole you know, sort of industry mechanism at place. Often when things get replaced, it's because it's by something more efficient and better. And I just have yet to see where a large public can feel compelled to see an artist's work in an interesting way consistently, where there are several great benefits attached, right? So, yeah, I think that the gallery model is here to stay. It can always do with adaptations and improvements. But the moment is definitely calling for a certain kind of doubling down, flight to quality, flight to rigor, and making sure that just the very best is out there so people don't have to even think about it. We're sort of propping up the whole machine with mediocre, with what's mediocre and subpar, and that may also kind of furnish certain truths that could be hard to swallow in terms of what beyond the smoke and mirrors the art world is truly comprised of, the diehards, the dedicated, the ones who really understand what this ecosystem is made of, right? So yes, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I really do think, as we highlighted before, more than the model to is that there is to criticize is more the character of certain galleries. So I think that the ones that will fail are the ones whose character isn't as stronger and don't, perpetuate a certain energy as you were defining before. And so it's not a lot about, how it is made, but more what is inside of it. I would say the ones that will differentiate who will survive and who won't, because it is becoming extremely competitive and,
Mhm.
yeah, as we said, very saturated too. And so we will see.
Yes, we shall. We shall. Yeah. I mean, how do you feel when you sort of walk around now? You're part of a whole new, generational way of thinking. It's remarkable to me what's happening, this entirely new, in fact, what I just said, this theoretical paradigm that's emerging along with a whole new generational framework, and it's fascinating to me. What do you feel when you kind of walk around and you experience what feels broken, what feels ripe for innovation, adaptation? What is your general sentiment when you sort of walk the byways and highways of the galleries, the art worlds, the artist studio system, and so on? What do you think?
Well, I think I'm a bit also like double-sided from that perspective because I think that it is important for certain galleries to remain and exist and the role of the gallery, but I also think that we're living in a period in which a lot of things are changing and a lot of technologies too. And so I think that there will be, new kind of like models that are going to be a bit less hierarchical and traditional. And the galleries that will not survive, I think, are the ones that have had this kind of format for a long time and do not remain contemporary. And maybe they were, relevant one day because they had a character that spoke to their times. It's
Yeah.
just like hard to keep up with the times and have, maybe the same spirit that the people that founded them, um,
Mm.
generations after generations. And
Mhm.
it's, like this idea of having the name of the founder as a gallery. I think it's so beautiful, but we have seen that when, they pass away, let's say the character isn't there anymore in a way. And I think it's interesting to think about that because it
Mm.
is a reflection also of the dealer,
Yes.
this gallery, I'm sure that you would agree that is also a reflection of yourself, of your eye, of your energy, of what you're drawn to, and a response to your environment. And so, what does it mean when,
Mhm.
not in your case, but in other galleries, when you are looking back at someone that, just isn't contemporary anymore?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, there's a beauty to that as well as a frustration, this idea that there is a finite quality to these things that, these galleries or entities really just present an idea that stretches a certain span of time, levels it, underlines it, highlights it, bakes it into the books of history, and then is gone, because this idea of going back is why it's so fundamental. Sometimes we have to look at these fundamental principles of energy and cycles, things that nature provides to us abundantly, which we, sometimes heed and sometimes don't. That yes, there is life and then there's death with all things, right? Including the galleries, including certain set of ideas that frame a time, and that subsiding makes way for new growth, right? So the new players, the new models, the new um, versions of things have a space. What would it be like if one entity just kept multiplying kind of infinitely? All the room would be taken up. So, but at the same time, we are always desperately in need of and hungry for these innovations and adaptation. So again, the yin and yang thing is so important to see both sides, all sides, and allow for what's natural and fruitful in them to take place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's like this obsession that we have with like the reject of like mortality and the rejection towards like
Mhm.
things to end, but things are meant to end.
Right.
And they're meant to evolve, and that's beautiful too. And this kind of leads me to another interesting topic, because when you are asking me about my opinion, what I'm seeing a lot is this idea of accessibility and democratization of the art world
Mhm.
through, let's say, really more accessible works of art in the form of even like prints. I feel like that is something that is very much happening, and it
Yeah.
has always been present. But I feel like now the kind of formats in which they're taking place, such as like, timed and limited editions that are signed and, with special papers and touches and all of, you name it, are
Hmm.
kind of something that becomes accessible for like younger audiences who are obviously not able to buy maybe like a painting. And
Yes.
so I wonder what even you think about that, and is it something that you ever did through your gallery or considered doing?
Mhm. Yes, I think it's very important. Any ecosystem is made up of different magnitudes of things, right? So this idea that there is a kind of entry level, kind of sophomoric level, the levels, that is in fact necessary for the functioning of the ecosystem itself. So I am, all the way behind approaches like that, to really excite new audiences that are gearing up to, be a part of the art world in a different kind of way down the line. And yes, our artists, they play with all the things. We have artists who are interested in printmaking, in just using different materials and methods that create different entry points. And so that for us is very natural. It's not even something that we have to sit down and study too hard. We just understand that it's part of the ecosystem design, and we embrace it fully.
Mhm, mhm. Well, amazing. Thank you for this. I think we need to leave some time for questions from whoever has.
Thank you so much, Ginevra and Nicola. This has been such a engaging conversation and has brought up so many interesting avenues for our audience to inquire about. Our first question is from GE. With Mathenge's work, with her representation of the figure asleep, struggling in sleep, with
Mhm.
the inclusion of clocks, sleep aids, and overhead light sources,
Mhm.
um, one thinks of Philip Guston's late works. Is there anything, oh, one thinks of Philip Guston's late works. Is there anything, any connection directly or indirectly here? Thank you. And Nicola, I know that you are not the artist, so if you were able to speak to this, great, however you feel.
Yeah, I mean, one could say that there is affinity there. I mean, as I'd mentioned earlier, Wangari is very aware of the history of painting, the great painters. And I would say she sort of more acutely, like I said, cites Matisse and Freud and and like Jenny Saville. But I think perhaps from the psychological perspective, one could draw this a parallel to Guston, this kind of awakening he himself has after trying different forms, different methods, different schools. and awakening regarding his own identity, but like that sleeplessness, that insomnia that he suffered, which really, I think, begs the question of the suffering being a necessary material for the artist, okay? Which I think Guston really expounds on well and shares at the base of the psychological construct of his paintings. And so, by that measure, I think Wangari is also swimming there in a different kind of way. She's perhaps more at the onset in terms of trying to, articulate that. But by nature, I think her restlessness has always traveled with her in a wonderfully generative way. So different, but same.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I love the sense of restlessness in these works. Our next question is from the Rail team. Chloe has a question.
Yeah, Nicola and Ginevra, this has been such a joy to listen to. Thank you both so much. I've really enjoyed it. Nicola, I'm curious to get your thoughts about what I feel is an increase towards more collaboration between galleries and a network of support between galleries. I know, for example, that Nicola, your gallery co-represents Uman with Hauser and Wirth, and that was such a great partnership to learn about and to see happen. And there have also been other partnerships sprouting up across New York, and we just had the campus on last month, a partnership between different galleries upstate, and I'm curious to hear about this tilt, seeing galleries sort of create strategic linkages with one another in their representation of artists, and what you think about that and what it means for galleries moving forward.
Yes, we all roads lead back to the cycle. So we are at the point in the cycle where a consolidation there's an inevitability to it. And of course, coming out of something as kind of life-shattering, earth-shattering as COVID, going back to this idea of the question of, who we are, what we stand for. I think there was some realization that the ecosystem needed to adapt away from maybe the pre-COVID model. Of course, it still retains very much of that, but this idea that there has to be a certain tether between the forces, between the magnitudes, between the levels in the hierarchy, that they can't sort of exist siloed and expect the actual ecosystem to function. So I think that is a kind of like the basic realization on all sides, right? So, the idea of collaboration is very natural to coming to that part in the cycle. And it is necessary, it's powerful, it is heartening, and it makes things better, I think it asks us to think more clearly about relationships, the risk of a growing industry is this anonymous super transaction, hyper transaction, it doesn't matter, it's all about the deal, which, some cases it is, but a lot of times, and particularly in our world, the relationship is still at the center of it. And for any of us who have been in the art world long enough, what we understand is that we're only together, and if we're committed, we're in it for the long haul. So we're going to encounter each other over and over and over again. So this idea that there is a kind of respect drawn around what it takes to, push one's way through this arena, which I liken to gladiator sport, is essential. And, what a large gallery versus a mid-size versus a very, very small gallery, that interplay. And, what Hauser and our gallery did was, really get to the basics, the idea that this artist is of a certain caliber, of a certain capacity, and that based on her unique qualities as an artist, us joining forces would be the best way that she would ascend well strategically, with a certain view towards a long-term career. And so it made a lot of sense. And my relationships with the gallery and the people there are strong. There are the people, and then there's the system, and you have to work in the context of both. And so, it's been a very rewarding collaboration. And I think a lot of people understand that, we don't need to silo. We can have a conversation and see if there is common ground and make it make sense for the artist and for the business.
Thank you, Nicola, for that answer. I'm going to pass it back over to Madison.
Thank you, Chloe. Our next question is going to come from Magley.
Thank you both so much for this conversation. It's been so wonderful to hear about your journey, Nicola. I was doing a bit of research on concept envy, and I saw that you had so many amazing curatorial projects. And I'm wondering if how you select who you represent now at your gallery, if that's like a continuation of your process with concept envy.
That's a great question. Yes, there is definitely the idea of selecting artists and determining ideas. It always goes back to that idea of what we sort of term cultural phenomenology, this idea that we are trying to find these little moments, these little permutations in the matrix, so to speak, that speak of a larger kind of force that's coming, rooted in that particular permutation. So, and that really is about then finding artists who can help articulate what society is going through, what it's going to go through, what it is it's reeling from, all of that. And so there's a little bit of a formula there. And the curatorial aspect is just an offshoot of that entire kind of framework. The combination, the putting together of all those elements then gives us a chance for an actual narrative, which is what we then develop and present.
Thank you so much for that answer.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your question, Magley. And next up, we have Fong.
Fong, Fong, woo!
Fong, you are muted, I believe.
I'm trying to unmute him as well.
Must get Fong's question.
There we go.
Here we are. Yeah. Hi, Nicola.
Hello, my dear.
Good to see you.
You too.
Thank you for coming on, and thank you, Ginevra, for a wonderful conversation. I might have missed a bit in the beginning. I was in the meeting, but given your amazing journey, and I mean it, because sometimes we know people who live their life like a trip, going somewhere from a certain, like go to work, not a labor of love. Obviously, you started out, I think you came to New York in the late 90s.
Yeah.
If I'm wrong.
Yes.
As the model.
Yes.
And became a writer before working for our friend Jeffrey.
Yes. Yes.
So share us, is there a moment of epiphany that you have to quit being being a writer? And then, I mean, being a writer certainly have an effect on the way you articulate verbally. It's quite brilliant and thoughtful, intelligently too. But I don't know the journey looked like when you start out.
The leap,
What was the epiphany that changed your life and changed the direction of that point onward to where you are now?
Well, thank you, Fong, for having me here today and your wonderful team of, superwomen doing, with us today. We love the rail to pieces and, we are happy to participate in any kind of call to action. So, yes, my years in fashion as a model, that was really my escape route from Jamaica.
Oh,
Okay. So, I grew up in Jamaica and I wanted to see the world again, going back to the basics, adventure, curiosity. And it was it's so long ago now, but it was a fascinating experience, being planted right in the center of downtown New York. When I landed and I had a chance to taste every aspect. And, this was the 90s, late 90s. I mean, people talk about the 70s and 80s, which, had its great moments and challenges and so on. But for me, that period was the late 90s, right? It was like 96, so almost 30 years in New York. And oh God, the city was so alive coming from, island girl, very sort of insulated world. And so it was my way to break out. But what I encountered and what I learned was beyond, it's beyond my imagination, just traveling the world. And really, it was the beginning of working with creative people, the photographers, the stylists, the makeup artists. These are all creative people in their own way. Some people might want to categorize it in a very separate, but these are all people articulating their art forms.
yeah.
And I really learned to observe and appreciate and to discern, frankly, things, beautiful things, ugly things, challenging things. Um, and then that transform I would say my sort of natural talent is writing, that's born with the capacity to put a sentence together and just try to develop that. And so I kind of used the fashion world as a leap into some of the publications and
Mm-hmm.
so on. And at the same time went back to school on the insistence of my parents who were just not going to have that my life would continue without some kind of you know, academic pursuit. And so that really was the timeline. And at the end, Jeffrey gave me an internship. So, coming out of school and that was where it really began. But how I'd become so fascinated with Jeffrey was because of my life downtown in fashion, because Jeffrey, as you know, was one of the few to really push his tentacles out into the cultural mainframe, this idea that yes, there is fine art and all the kind of respect and pedestals that deserves, but then there's also the cultural informational sphere, which as in a way implicates the fine art sphere. And he really understood that music, fashion, the whole thing. And like I said, no social media. We were busy like staying curious and getting together and pushing the boundaries and all the ways all these forms could join and make some new magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it was very, very natural. With his gallery, I found a very natural home and a team of A type women and incredibly ambitious projects. And again at that time post 9/11 when there was chaos, but this idea that our generation was going to wade through the rubble and try to be generative about things.
Mm-hmm. I see. Well, that's a really true aesthetic confession if you ever heard one.
Right
Thank you,
on.
Nicola. Thank you so much. Back to you, Madison.
Thank you so much, Fong. I loved getting to hear more about that history, Nicola, and what brought you here today. So my final question to close out today's wonderful NSE calls back to the discussion you and Ginevra were having about energy. And I loved how you talked about how this energy is very rooted in the real and the scientific and the spiritual. And I was curious, has there been any show at the gallery where the energy surprised you, or there was something unexpected in the energy once it was installed and had really like settled into that space?
God, now you ask, which of my children do I is my favorite? Because in a way, they all surprised me with them realizing the principle so fully and in ways beyond my imagination, right? And you think about Ming Smith, our first show, this artist who for decades has been wielding her camera like a kind of wand, an alchemical wand, her ability to, transmute the atmosphere into something solid into atmosphere. I mean, that is alchemy, that is energetic play. You think about, Alteronce Gumby, who is looking at the science of color and light in order to shift your concept of perception, These are rooted in energetic principle, as much as he's looking at the cosmos and, the material capacity to create new forms of seeing. You're thinking about something like Uman, who's stretching into like the primordial, like ancient energy of the universe to like find in the depths of her imagination scenes and depictions and narratives that we could never even imagine. We're thinking about Julia Chiang, who's looking at the idea of focus and repetition as its own energetic play and with a very powerful energetic consequence. We're thinking about Adebunmi Gbadebo, who is looking at the ancestral, all the things buried underneath that have, a sub-earth, core earth energy that she's bringing into new form. We're thinking about Elizabeth Schwaiger, who is thinking about the environment and memory and our sort of, I mean, today, we have Milton about to, sort of truly is Florida secession, and this idea that the memory from loss relative to environment and that kind of haunting, that's an energetic principle. Alberta Whittle talking about healing energy, this idea that, you're looking at the poles on a spectrum and bringing them together in a place of healing and using that energy. And someone like Alvaro Barrington, who is looking at travel, this idea of migration and putting ideas together that are born from different places, which is very much yielded in kind of material energy, this fierceness of material, kind of conflict, but that brings you real harmony. It's remarkable. So yes, they all have done it. They're all my favorite children.
Thank you so much. I feel like your answer to that, as well as this discussion today, is going to impact the way I feel next time I step into a gallery, because I think it's so tempting to be in touch with the mind when you're in these spaces, and it's going to be, I think, a real privilege to try to engage with the body and the energy. So thank you so much. Thank you both, Nicola and Ginevra. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern for a conversation with Sandra Bloodworth, Cheryl Hageman, and Jessica Holmes for a conversation on the publication of Contemporary Art Underground, MTA Arts and Design, New York. And now you can turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave, as is real tradition. Thank you so much, Ginevra and Nicola, for joining us today.
Great.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Nicola.
much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for coming. Thank you,
Thank
Ginevra.
you. Thank you. And congratulations. Thank you, guys.
Congratulations. Thank you. And come see the show right now at the gallery, you guys.
All right. Thank you so much.
Right on.